Ignatius Press and the Augustine Institute present the Formed Book Club. Catholic book lovers unpacking good books, chapter by chapter. If you like us, please help us by subscribing and by reviewing us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you might listen. And don't forget to sign up for weekly updates and study questions at formedbookclub.ignatius.com.
Welcome back to the Formed Book Club, and I say welcome back advisedly because this should not be a good time to start this book club participation because we're on the last leg of our discussion of this book by Russell Shaw called, if I may look at the title here, 8 Popes in the Crisis of Modernity. And we will not have Russell Shaw be with us at the end of the book, so we'll have to handle this ourselves in this last session. And we're going to start with Pope St. Paul VI, June 21st, 63 to August 6, 78. And we'll continue with John Paul I, very briefly, whose pontificate was only 33 days long. And finally with John Paul II, St. John Paul II, whom no amount of time would be sufficient for, it seems to me, on a discussion program. But who wants to jump in on Pope St. Paul VI before I do?
Well, I have 110 is my earliest highlighted passage.
Oh, let me guess.
Yes, you can guess. But yeah, I mean, obviously the title intrigued me. Am I Hamlet or Don Quixote? You know, obviously being a literature person, that intrigued me. But then, you know, the second full paragraph on that page there, dogging Paul too was his hesitancy in making hard decisions, which caused some to liken him and even moved him to liken himself to Shakespeare's indecisive Prince of Denmark, Hamlet. And it's sort of off topic, but it's Russell Shaw's fault for bringing the topic up. That you know, in my book Through Shakespeare's Eyes, I go to considerable length to show that Hamlet is not a procrastinator. That basically what he doesn't do, he doesn't make rash decisions, and he doesn't actually make decisions until he knows something's correct. So he doesn't, for instance, act upon what the ghost tells him till he knows the ghost is an honest ghost. So that, in other words, and he talks about, he says to his mother that it's bad for reason panders will. If you allow your reason to pander your will, you're in trouble. So, you know, he never allows that to happen. So he's circumspect. And being circumspect is not the same thing as being a procrastinator. So whether or not Paul is Saint Paul VI is a procrastinator, or whether he's circumspect, there's an important difference between the two, and I don't want Hamlet's name to be besmirched.
Well, that's a very good point. At the time, because I was alive at the time, I was quite critical because the church had taught for almost 2,000 years that the gift of sexual diversity, or man and woman, was for marriage, and that in marriage you had to be open to life, and you could not voluntarily exclude procreation, you know, in your marriage. And he was being called upon to change that teaching, and he set up a commission to review it, a large commission, and the large majority of that commission had told him it's all right, you can make a change. So really, for someone to be Pope and think to himself, you know, I'm going to make a change in doctrine which has been unchanged for almost 2,000 years, can I do that? Should I do that? What evidence should I have? So looking back on it, I'm less critical now because of the difficult decision. And if there's any proof we need of the Holy Spirit acting in the church, I mean, he hesitated. He had liberal tendencies himself, but he realized, no, this is the decision he could not make to make a change like that.
Yeah, and then of course he produced Humanae Vitae, which has become the solid document on the topic. Which
well,
is
exactly. That was the whole point. This commission was set up to discuss that very question.
Well, I learned in this book on page 114 that commission had been established by Pope John.
That's right. That's right.
And so really, Pope Paul VI inherited this And the commission had been set up to discuss population because that was a UN priority, and it kind of broadened to include this question because along the way the birth control pill came on the scene. And so yes, I too, Father, when I found that out and realized he didn't bring this commission into being, he didn't set its agenda, he got saddled with it. I know there are people who accuse him of dilly-dallying, but I can't imagine the burden that this was, all the pressures all around him, and yet he upheld the unchanging teaching of the church.
And certainly, go ahead, Joseph.
Sorry. Well, certainly, the default position for a pope, if we're talking about any question of changing something doctrinal, is to err on the side of caution. And if that includes dilly-dallying, then so be it. What you don't want is a reckless pope who's going to come in and say, because it's something which is very popular with the zeitgeist, and do something which is going to have huge ramifications that's going to take an awful lot of mess to sort out.
That is true. However, because of the power and extent of the media at the time, this is 1968, he was doing this, because of the weight, there was an expectation created. Well, of course we're going to change. He's preparing it, he's discussing it, he's getting counsel on this. And so the whole media had prepared everybody for it. Well, obviously the church is going to now adapt to the times. It's going to happen. And because of that, when it did happen, there was huge disappointment. Whereas if he had said, like probably Pius XII would have, no, we can't change this, period, let's move on, that might have deflected a lot of what happened after his decision.
Right, which is, I think, largely Russell Shaw's position here was the fact that it took so long became part of the problem. One thing I find very encouraging in a sort of perverse sort of way is that we sort of live we're always tempted to live thinking our days are the worst of days. And you talk about the media, and obviously big tech and big media now are doing their stuff, right? But the media in the late 60s, there was only in the West anyway, right? There was communism in the East, but apart from the developing world, in the West, the media was 100% gung ho for the whole hippie sexual revolution, sexual liberation thing, and dissident voices were shot down. And so some things don't change, and that's, or whatever that is, 60 years ago now.
I think another important thing to realize is that he wasn't getting support from his fellow bishops.
Yes.
And that's on page 116, when he talks about what the bishops of the United States did after Humanae Vitae was published. They put out their own pastoral letter on human life in our day, and they supported the encyclical. And yet, what did they do? They spoiled the effect of their statement by including a section headed Norms of Licit Theological Dissent
I know.
that provided guidelines for rejecting the encyclical. Now, if that isn't a two-faced stab in the back, so
well,
don't know is behind the scenes when he probably was trying to build some kind of, as previous popes have done before issuing an important statement, gather the other bishops around him, gather those who are in support in order to present to the world, this is not one man's unilateral decision. And I have a feeling that behind the scenes, there was a lot of bishops who were pressuring him to change. And that's why they went ahead and covered their backsides with this two-faced document when Humanae Vitae was published.
Which again, back to the big tech, big media, 1960s and now, I mean, what's different, right? The weak bishops that do not actually defend the faith, which is what they're called to do, is one of the big problems in the church. You have the enemy from without, the media, but they're only able to be as successful as they are because of the third column, fifth column within, right? And that's the issue, is weak at best bishops. Say some things never change.
And what faithful Catholics have to do, and we're trying to help do it ourselves and help them, is to support the bishops so they will have a little backing when they make tough decisions. And the second part of this book's title is The Crisis of Modernity. And certainly in the middle of the 20th century, I don't think any document was more apt to stem the tide of this modernistic view of self-indulgence than Humanae Vitae. It's probably the most important papal document of the 20th century, because the crisis we have, I believe, in our time, I'm looking at America especially because that's where I am, where I live, I know what's going on here, but it's a crisis of family. You know, who's in jail? People who didn't have any parents or only one parent, you know. Who's using drugs? People from broken families. Not entirely, not 100%, but you look at the statistics, and broken families are the major indicator of every societal ill that we've got, from poverty to drug use to imprisonment. And how do you respond to that crisis? You have to reiterate what the church is teaching about man, woman, married for life, open to life. And once you accept contraception, you don't need marriage. You know, marriage is infertile. Well, why get married? Or why not everybody get married, you know? So this was an incredibly important document.
Which is why, by the way, you know, that if I may make a gentle rebuke to Russell Shaw, because it's a fine book, at the bottom of page 115, he says, looking back, it is clear that Humanae Vitae could hardly have come at a worse time. On the contrary, it could hardly have come at a better time, right? It's exactly when it was needed. It was countercultural, it was kicking against the pricks, but it was absolutely necessary.
And we can see that once the logic between marriage and procreation is unwound, now you can have procreation outside of marriage in artificial methods and technologies. And now they're experimenting, with artificial wombs and implanting human embryos in animal wombs and all these crazy things.
Right. Yeah, sorry. Can I just use that as an excuse to bring in my neo-Luddite tendencies? Because we're going back a page or so, but in Populorum Progressio, Russell Shaw actually quotes a chunk from that encyclical, and there's I love what he says about technology. That's in the light of the pill and in various other types of technology you were talking about.
What page are you on?
This is page 113. It's in the middle of the block quote. I'm going to begin. The reign of technology, technocracy as it is called, can cause as much harm to the world of tomorrow as liberalism did to the world of yesteryear. Economics and technology are meaningless if they do not benefit man, for it is they are to serve. Man is truly human only if he is the master of his own actions and the judge of their worth, only if he is the architect of his own progress. He must act according to his God-given nature, freely accepting its potentials and its claims upon him. So claims upon him, responsibilities. But the key thing is here, that we're now living in a macroeconomic, technocratic society where we have no control. Basically, that we are just part of something which is much bigger than we are, and we're just cogs in the machine. And if we try to not be cogs in the machine, then we become enemies of the state.
Joseph, I now look back on my long life to the extent I can remember what happened earlier, and recall that, after as a young man, I come to the conclusion that God exists and Christ is his son, and he founded a church. Every time I read a papal encyclical or part of it, it struck me as concise, powerful, true, just like what you read there, It was so self-evident to me that the truth was being professed here. Now, I can't say that's extended all the way into the present, but certainly most of the encyclicals, most of the time, have that clarity and that ring of truth of what you just read.
And you're a cradle Catholic, Father, but a large part of my conversion were the papal encyclicals. I mean, they spoke with just with gravitas, but with succinctness, and with logic, and reason, and quite clearly an antidote to the poison that you see all around you.
That's right. That's exactly right.
It
When I
isn't.
was dating my husband to be, and I was not yet a Catholic. I was on my way to becoming a Catholic, and I remember, well, what's all this about birth control and the Catholic Church and blah 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 blah? And he just said, "Read Humanae Vitae, and then we can talk about it." And when I did, I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe how it all made sense and how prophetic it was, how true it was. So these people who claim that when the church, stays faithful to her teaching, that this somehow is turning people away, that this somehow is offending people and they're going running in. No, it's the exact opposite is true. If you are open to God.
Nobody converts to the Catholic Church because they're enamored of the zeitgeist. And I look at the mass that we go to, and it's the traditional mass, and they're converts. I call them kids now because I'm old. The married couples about 30 years old, already with 5 or 6 kids, completely on fire for the faith, and they've come from all sorts of secular backgrounds. And they didn't convert because they wanted more of the zeitgeist. They wanted to convert because they could see the poison of the zeitgeist.
Well, let me ask you this: you who are younger than I am, in your lifetime, what institution other than the church has been right 100% of the time when it comes to these issues? Name one. There isn't one.
There isn't one, no. Exactly.
I mean, there's individuals, there's good people, there's smaller groupings, but it's a mystery to me of faith and of the Holy Spirit that the Catholic Church has remained true to what is obvious.
Right.
You think of John Paul II, what's he defending? He's not just defending revelation, he's defending reason at a time when reason is being rejected as an instrument by which we can know the truth.
Yeah.
I want to point out something. This is a minor issue here, but on page 111 at the bottom, I had to laugh when I read this thing.
111?
111 at the bottom. This is about, Paul VI, when he was, Roman Curial officer. In November 1954, after a falling out with the Pope, apparently occasioned by his comparatively liberal leanings, Pius V named him Archbishop of the giant Archdiocese of Milan. So here's the problem. You think you guys are a problem in your curia, and what do? You make him Archbishop of the largest diocese in Italy, next to Rome. I mean, do we have to always bump people up to get rid of them?
Right.
Can we bump people out?
Right. Yeah, they did. I read that and I thought, well, that's just odd. I mean, if that's a demotion. The other thing, again, just another gentle rebuke, and I know that Ignatius Press has published a bit of trial, but on middle of page 117, he talks about the far right of the Catholic spectrum. First of all, I don't like the terminology of left and right. That's a product of the French Revolution. It's about right and wrong, and it's discovered whether something's right or wrong, not whether it's right or left. But then he calls evening war.
Joseph, that's what far right means. You're really right. You're not really wrong.
I can live with that definition on things.
Okay.
But he then calls evening war an extreme conservative. And I just think that's just unnecessary. And let me just say one thing very briefly about this. Evening War had all sorts of problems with what was going on in the 1960s, and there's not necessarily anything wrong with that, right? It doesn't make you an extreme conservative. But he went to confession on Holy Saturday. He went to Mass on Easter Sunday, and within half an hour getting home from church, he dropped dead. Now, if that's not an act of mercy on the part of God, regardless of what an incorrigible so-and-so he was, and if we can not sort of think that, well, yeah, how can evening war not be in heaven? Right? Went to confession on Holy Saturday, went to Mass, comes home from Mass, and drops down dead. I mean, I think he deserves more respect than the epithet extreme conservative and far right implies there.
All right, I'll accept that. let's move on because we're going to finish this book today, and I think we have time to do it, especially since the smiling Pope, good John Paul I, I mean, what do we say except that he lived for 33 days after he was elected Pope? I mean,
well, the only thing I've got on that chapter, I think, Father, I would like to mention it, is that his book Illustrissimi, which is very good. That again, Russell Shaw mentions the imaginary letters to both fictional and real people. And he mentions Pinocchio, Figaro, St. Teresa of Avila, Charles Dickens, Mark Twain, Goethe, King David, and Jesus, even. He doesn't mention G.K. Chesterton, because there's actually one of the letters is to Chesterton. And I thought, well, he should be, if you're going to make that long list, that name should be in there, right?
yes. Okay. Let's move on to Pope St. John Paul II. And here, we need no excuses for diminution of our discussion because you can't possibly discuss what this man did in a 27-year reign as Pope in any one session or 10 sessions. So we can take the highlights. But I want to look at the subtitle there, or the little epigram on page 133, the first postmodern Pope. Now, why does he call him a postmodern Pope? I mean, page 134 and 35, he quotes George Weigel here, and basically he's saying that Pope John Paul II reiterated the fact that there's such a thing as things with natures that we can know. So I suppose he meant that by postmodern, that after modernism eventually led to nihilism and voluntarism, John Paul II was certainly the great advocate of reason and knowing what things are and conforming oneself to reality outside oneself. So I think that's what he means by the first postmodern Pope.
Yeah, I as I've said before in previous sessions, I'm uncomfortable with the differentiation between modernism and postmodernism, but we don't have to go there again now. But it's just it's embracing the term that postmodernists have invented, basically.
Well, I also see in the term simply where he's situated in time, you know, in the era that he is in, but also because he he defended the teaching of the church, but he did so in a rather unique way, drawing from his training in personalism, you know, a philosophical school that certainly is not an abandonment of reason at all, but does take up into itself the subjective experience of man and finds in it signposts to objective reality and norms. And he did this in such a stunning way. And probably the biggest example on page 136, where Russell Shaw brings in his book, Love and Responsibility, which was published in 1960. So Humanae Vitae is 1968, but John Paul II, prior to becoming Pope, has already tackled this subject matter and going about it in a very unique way from previous ways in which the church has approached her teaching. And so I see him as an oracle to postmodern man in a real sort of way, and was perfectly suited for his moment in history for becoming Pope, in being able to address some of these topics in a fresh way and restore to them something fresh.
Yeah, you mentioned that providential. You think about that providential in terms of modernism and the crisis of the family and of sexuality and so on, but also modernism in the sense of totalitarian regimes. I mean, certainly he had a major role to play in the dissolution of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, that's on page 137. That's what I've highlighted. For me, you know, if we want to look at global world affairs, whether we're Catholic or not, you know, people talk about Ronald Reagan's role, and I'm not denying that, Margaret Thatcher's role. He doesn't mention Alexander Solzhenitsyn's role. But for me, Pope John Paul, St. John Paul was the biggest influence. And I'll tell you why. because it was his influence in Poland that brought about the rise of and of the solidarity movement and the whole "Be Not Afraid," and there was a domino effect. That when the Poles had enough courage to stand up to communism, which was a direct consequence to one of their own having the courage to stand up to communism in the midst of communism, on visit to Poland, that led to that rise in Poland, and then when it was successful there, everybody else in the Soviet Empire got courage from that, and that domino effect is a direct consequence. So there are other, Ronald Reagan, Star Wars, economic sanctions, and other things. It's not, and of course Solzhenitsyn's work to just expose the tyranny itself. But I do think that if you have to name one person above all of those, it would be St. John Paul II.
And I don't want to take anything away from that, but when you look about how the Catholic Church was in East Germany, or in Lithuania, or in Latvia, certainly in Russia with the Orthodox, possibly even Hungary, if it hadn't been for the Catholics in Poland and their leaders, I'm thinking especially of Cardinal Wyszynski here, who preceded, Cardinal Wojtyła in Krakow, the Poles had maintained the faith through this communist persecution. And there's a beautiful event. I mean, in order to kind of keep the Catholic faith of the Poles alive, Cardinal Wyszynski planned a pilgrimage of the statue of Lady Czestochowa, who was a great Marian, shrine, of the Poles, all around Poland. And the communist government forbade that he bring that portrait around to these parishes. And so they brought an empty frame and they had thousands and thousands of Poles coming out to honor Our Lady in an empty frame. So the faith of the Poles was preserved because of the great leaders the Poles had during that communist period. And that set the stage what John Paul II was able to do. But if it hadn't been for that, if he didn't have 2-3 million people coming when he gave those talks, it would have worked,
Right. Absolutely. I agree.
And it helped that the Western powers had decided they were not going to stand by and watch another Hungarian.
Yes.
Because when the Hungarians also tried to break free from the Soviet dominion, and the Soviet tanks rolled in, no Western powers tried to stop that. And Ronald Reagan said, we're not going to have another Hungary in 1956. If the Soviets try to roll in and crush this movement, we're going to stop them.
Yeah.
So now you see this great mystery, right, between who says the wars in heaven are the wars on earth, or vice versa? Did Tolkien say that, or somebody, that these wars are waged on multiple levels at once, and the spirit and the flesh, and it's all mixed together. But I agree with you both that without the spirit, the flesh caves in fear.
Yeah, and I think that's true. Part. I mean, you had the Hungarian uprising, 1957, the Czech uprising, 1968. But what's the response of the West is important. But also, how strong is communism internally is also important. And I think, by the 1980s, the communism is bankrupt. It's always bankrupt spiritually, but the point is the chickens are coming home to roost. It's like the culture of death we're living under now. As Chesterton said, the best way of destroying a utopia is to try it. Right? Let's have this culture of death 40 or 50 years, and we'll see what's left. And so, again, bottom of page 137 here. Years later, John Paul himself attributed the fall of Soviet communism, now not to Ronald Reagan or something like himself, largely to the reaction against, quote, the spiritual void brought about by atheism. In other words, it contains the seeds of its own destruction.
Yes, evil always does.
Yes, exactly.
So, looking back on this book, let me say something and have you compliment or correct it. In terms of the Crisis of Modernity, the three figures that stand out to me are Pius X in the early part of the century, who explicitly condemned modernism as the farrago of all the heresies and did what he could to resist it, had the oath against modernism and so on. And then I think it's Paul VI with Humanae Vitae, who makes the prophetic and incredibly important statement in Humanae Vitae. And then John Paul II, who with his teaching and his actions as Pope, really tried to restore the order of rule of law and rule of reason. So those three stand out to me.
I'm not disagreeing with you, because I agree with you all of those three, but I would have an addendum. I do think that Benedict XV was important as someone who had attempted to avert World War I, along with Blessed Karl of Austria. And if those two men had been listened to, the whole of 20th century history would have been very, very different. And I do think Pius XI and Pius XII are very important for their the courage against the rise of new totalitarian regimes. And we seem to be moving towards a new totalitarianism. I think the example of Pius XI and Pius XII might be very valuable as we move forward into these dark times.
Vivian, anything?
Well, I noticed that you skipped over the Second Vatican Council, and it's
I was talking about popes here, In
right.
fact,
Well, the Pope who opened that council, John the 23rd, I guess it's just too early, as Joseph keeps reminding us, to know, what the long-term results of that are going to be. But he certainly had a tremendous impact.
It's true. You can't ignore the Second Vatican Council.
You kind of can't ignore it, right? And the Pope who called it as having had a huge impact on Catholicism throughout the world. And anyway, I just throw that out there.
I think we've done very well there. So poor old Pope John Paul I.
Yeah.
It's not his fault. He only had 33 days.
So
he just kept the chair warm.
He did.
Yeah. Well, I'm not going to ask the question of whether or not the Vatican Council fostered or resisted modernism, or whether as an event it led to the resistance or the fostering of modernism. But next week we'll start with Joseph Cardinal Zen's book, For Love of My People, I Will Not Be Silent. And this is a very topical book because it has to do with the church in China. And as I'm holding it up to you, I'm also looking at the back. I want you to notice on the back here, there's an ISBN number. There's a barcode there. But in our books, you can peel it off like that. So there's no barcode there that makes a book seem to be an object of merchandise. But all books, like the Biblos, the primary book, the Bible, have a certain sacredness to them, or should. At Ignatius Press, we want to have beautiful books, sound content, and not treat them as objects of commerce, even though we depend upon your buying our books for us to keep going. But anyway, so we will divide this book, like all Gaul, into tres partes, into 3 parts. And next week, we'll take the introduction and chapters 1 and 2. All right?
Very good.
Amen. Hallelujah. See you all next week. God bless to all of the followers of the Formed Book Club.
If you enjoyed this discussion, please help spread the word about the Formed Book Club by subscribing to the podcast and writing a review. You can sign up for weekly updates at formedbookclub.ignatius.com.